Narcissistic is an increasingly common term, often associated with self-centered people who desperately seek admiration and seem detached from others. But do we fully understand the depth of this concept? What if I told you that Sigmund Freud, more than a century ago, explored the complex roots of this self-love, showing that it is much more than simple vanity or selfishness? Today, we will delve into Freud's authentic conception of narcissism to discover how it can illuminate our understanding of ourselves and interpersonal dynamics beyond superficial labels. Welcome to a new in-depth study dedicated to the thought of Sigmund Freud. After analyzing the stages of child development, today we focus on a commonly used but sometimes inappropriate term, narcissism. Before it became widespread, Freud offered a psychological interpretation of considerable depth. By the end of this presentation, you will be able to distinguish healthy self-esteem from more complex dynamics, and will have more refined tools for interpreting certain behaviors. Let's start with the origins. The term derives, as we know, from the Greek myth of Narcissus, the young man of extraordinary beauty who inevitably fell in love with his own reflection. Freud adopted this myth to introduce the concept of an investment of libido, our fundamental psychic energy linked to pleasure, in the ego or in oneself. It is crucial, however, to understand that Freud makes a fundamental distinction, identifying two main forms of narcissism. 1. Primary narcissism. This is a normal and universal stage of development. In the early stages of life, the newborn does not clearly distinguish between itself and the outside world. Its entire libido is self-directed, focused on its own needs and sensations. This is an original self-love, essential for survival and for building a basic sense of self-esteem. The child is, at this stage, His Majesty the baby, the epicenter of its own universe. This primary narcissism forms the basis from which the capacity to love external objects will later develop. 2. Secondary narcissism. Here the dynamic becomes even more complex. As the individual grows, they begin to invest their libido in external objects, primarily parental figures, the so-called object love, which we encounter when discussing the Oedipus complex. What happens, however, if these external libidinal investments are frustrated, disappointed, or if the individual suffers significant emotional wounds? According to Freud, a portion of this libido can be withdrawn from external objects and reinvested in the self. This process gives rise to secondary narcissism. It's as if, in the face of disappointment or relationship difficulties, the ego inflates with libido, so to speak, and returns to being the primary object of love. This mechanism can be activated at different stages of life, not just in childhood, as a reaction to loss, failure, or traumatic events. Let's emphasize an essential point. For Freud, a certain degree of narcissism, understood as self-love, self-esteem, is essential for psychological balance. Without a solid primary narcissistic cathexis, the ego could not develop the strength necessary to cope with the vicissitudes of existence. The problem arises when this investment in the ego becomes excessive, rigid, and compromises the ability to love and relate to others in a mature and reciprocal way. Freud did not formulate a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder according to current nosographic categories, but his pioneering observations have laid the foundation for understanding these dynamics. Excessive secondary narcissism, according to Freudian theory, can manifest itself through a feeling of greatness and superiority, a marked difficulty in experiencing empathy towards others, a constant need for admiration and recognition, a notable fragility in the face of criticism, since an overinvested ego is, paradoxically, also very vulnerable, a difficulty in establishing deep and reciprocal interpersonal relationships. Another aspect of considerable interest in Freudian thought on narcissism concerns narcissistic object choice, or the ways in which one chooses one's partner. Freud distinguished between anaclitic or support object choice. We love those who have provided care for us or who resemble those figures, e.g., a breastfeeding mother. Narcissistic object choice. In this mode, one loves, or what one is, or what one was, a past version of oneself. or what one would like to be, one's ego ideal. O, the person who was part of oneself, e.g., a child. Essentially, in narcissistic choice, one seeks in the other a reflection of oneself or one's own ideal. This dynamic is not intrinsically pathological, but it can acquire problematic connotations if it becomes the sole relational modality, and if the other is perceived solely as an extension of one's own self. What lessons can we draw, then, from Freud's conception of narcissism, beyond current simplifications? Self-love is a crucial element. An adequate level of narcissism is healthy and necessary. Early experiences are crucial. The foundations of our relationship with ourselves are laid in childhood. Balance is key. A lack of self-love is problematic, as is an excess that undermines relationships with others. Behind grandiosity often lies a fragility. A narcissistically overinvested ego can be compared to an overinflated balloon, which risks collapsing at the slightest pressure. Freud's contribution invites us to consider narcissism not as a mere negative character trait, but as a complex psychic dynamic with deep roots, and, to a certain extent, intrinsic to the human condition. Has this Freudian analysis of narcissism changed or enriched your understanding of the concept compared to its more common meaning? What reflections has it generated? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd be very interested in reading your perspectives. If this insight was helpful to you, a like is always welcome. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on upcoming content. Thank you for exploring with me the complexities of Freud's narcissism. Remember, understanding is the essential first step to overcoming oversimplifications. See you next time. Sincerely.